Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Hi. Well, welcome back to Practicing Shamatha, Developing Mindfulness. The link for last week's video is in and also the slides is in the chat. So Glenn, thank you for teaching us, and please start whenever you're ready.
I think it's time to start. So let's begin this third session here in this Shamatha practice program. So I'd like to welcome everyone back to this program. This third session now will be looking at the mindfulness of breathing practice, focusing on the abdomen. And this is the third in 6 sessions in this program. The first one, we had an introduction to Shamatha. Last week, we looked at the full body breath practice. This time, the focusing on the abdomen. Next week, the third variation of mindfulness of breathing, focusing at the nostrils. In the 5th session, we'll be looking at how to use the Shavasana posture for meditation. And then the last 6th session will be about how to integrate this practice into daily life. Recommended reading for this program, Attention Revolution from Alan Wallace. There's an excellent book on this Shamatha practice. Let's have a look at what we'll be covering in today's session. We'll begin with a meditation, focusing on mindfulness of breathing, focusing on the rhythm of the breath. This is a variation of the full body practice we did last week, emphasizing relaxation. Following that, we'll begin with a short review of some of the earlier points in this program. The main topic for this session is faults, i.e. what sorts of faults can arise in this Shamatha practice and how do we overcome them. Then we'll move on to today's practice, that is mindfulness of breathing, focusing on the abdomen. So we'll do a guided meditation for that. Following that, we'll begin the presentation on the stages of progress in this Shamatha practice, this 9-stage model, using those various handouts that you have all got some access to. We'll be looking at the first 4 stages in that model today. Time for question and answer at the end of the session as per normal. If you have any questions as we go through the session, you can just put them in the chat. And then Sunny will read out the questions at the end of the session. Let's begin with the meditation. As I mentioned, we'll be doing a mindfulness of breathing, a sort of a very close variation of the full body breath practice that we did last week. In this meditation, we'll be focusing on the rhythm of the breath. So simply noticing if the breath is long or short, deep or shallow, slow or fast. So just noticing what the breath is doing. The trick, of course, is without trying to modify it in any way. We're not trying to make the breathing rhythmic or deep or shallow or slower or anything. Just noticing whatever the breath is doing. Is it long? Is it short? Is it deep or shallow? Is it slow or fast? And in this practice, like last week, the emphasis is one of relaxation. So particularly on each out breath, relaxing and releasing any tension in the body or mind, and on each out breath, releasing any thoughts that may have arisen. So really working on relaxation, but without allowing yourself to sink into dullness. That's the balance, to maintain whatever clarity you began with as we're relaxing more deeply, simply noticing the rhythm of the breath. Let's do that practice now. Find a nice comfortable posture. Let's begin. We begin as always by preparing the body, setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. And so whilst keeping the back nice and straight, allow the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. Using the out breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. And softening and relaxing all the muscles in the face. The mouth and jaw soft and relaxed. And all the muscles around the eyes soft and relaxed. And in this way, allowing the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. And having established a good posture, then keeping the body as still as possible, avoiding any unnecessary movement. Allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. Simply allowing the breathing to flow naturally and effortlessly. Not trying to control or regulate the breath in any way. And then preparing the mind, setting it into a state of ease and relaxation, releasing all activities of the mind, and simply allowing the mind to come to rest, in the present moment, resting in stillness. Allowing the mind to remain relaxed, still, and clear. And then whilst maintaining a relaxed body and mind, then from that stillness, start to become aware of the rhythm of your breath. Noticing if it's long or short, deep or shallow, slow or fast. Without trying to modify it in any way. Simply noticing the rhythm of the breath. And in this meditation, emphasizing the basis of relaxation. And so using the out breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in the body or the mind. And maintaining that ongoing flow of mindfulness of the rhythm of the breath. And we can bring the meditation to a close. Let's start with a short review of some of the earlier points we covered in the earlier sessions. In this shamatha training, we are going to be looking at the prerequisites for shamatha. In other words, how to set up our life in such a way to support this practice. And we'll look at that in session 6. With respect to the actual practice, there's 2 parts. There's meditation and integrating into daily life. And with the actual meditation practice, we've already looked at how to prepare body, speech, and mind in session 1. And with respect to the actual shamatha meditation, we also looked in session 1 at what qualities we are to cultivate. And in the last session, we then looked at what objects should we use to focus on in this practice, and what tools do we use in this practice. This session, we're going to go on to look at what faults could arise in the practice and how do we overcome them. And then also in session 6, how to integrate this practice into daily life. And with any practice, it would be good to know how we are progressing. Are we progressing, and how far have we got in the practice? And so here, starting in this session and continuing in the next 2 sessions, we'll look at this classical 9-stage model for shamatha in terms of how to progress the stages we go through in this practice to shamatha. And we'll use those handouts for that purpose. And that'll come later in this session. In terms of the preparing body, speech, and mind, we saw there that to settle the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, vigilance. So keeping the back straight, the body relaxed, and keeping it as still as possible. Basically to set and then forget the body so that so we can forget about the body during meditation, that it doesn't cause any problems or obstacles in the actual meditation. And then allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. That will help to start to settle the mind, any agitation in the mind. And then to really settle the mind into, again, a state of relaxation, stillness, bringing it into the present moment, and remaining clear, having a clear mind. And on that basis, to engage in the main practice. And here we first looked in session 1 also what qualities to cultivate in the shamatha training. And in the old meditation texts, generally they mention 2 qualities, stability and clarity. A stable mind to overcome excitation or distraction, and also to be able to focus clearly to overcome laxity or dullness. But here we added a 3rd quality that's not often mentioned in the old meditation texts, something that is very important for us in the modern world, and that is relaxation. Because many of us, due to our lifestyle and constantly bombarded by stimulus, our minds tend to be quite agitated and chaotic, and we have a lot of tension in our mind. And whenever we focus on things, we apply a lot of tension, and we tend to bring this into meditation practice. And if we try to do this or any other meditation with this sort of tense mind, we're going to have all sorts of difficulties. So the very first thing to do, and that's what we've been doing so far in the sessions up until this meditation, is emphasizing this quality of relaxation, to have a relaxed body, a relaxed mind to overcome the tension. On that basis, using that analogy of a tree, having sunk the deep roots of relaxation, that will be able to then support a strong trunk of stability. The stronger the trunk of stability, the higher the leaves and branches of clarity can grow. So this, emphasizing these 3 qualities in this order, and that's what we're doing in these sessions. We emphasized relaxation up until now. In the next meditation, at the end of this session, we'll emphasize stability, and in the next session, we'll move to clarity. And in terms of objects, we saw there from the recommended reading, Attention Revolution by Alan Wallace, that he particularly recommends 3 objects for us in the modern world. The breath, or mindfulness of breathing. This is an object that's probably most widely emphasized in many Buddhist traditions. But also he emphasizes focusing on the mind, or in other words, observing thoughts, and also the awareness practice of simply resting in awareness. They also have their own unique benefits for us in the modern world. And in particular, Alan Wallace recommends for the first 4 stages, which we're going to look at later in this session, to use mindfulness of breathing. And so I think that's probably true that for many of us, particularly in the modern world, at least initially, I think mindfulness of breathing is probably going to be the best object to use for this practice. And hence, we're using this object for this Shamatha training program. We also saw, though, in Tsongkhapa's Lam Rim text, his Shamatha section, he also recommends using a mental image of a Buddha, focusing, here it says, focusing on the body of the Tathagata, use a mental image of a Buddha. And that has its own advantages, particularly it's very good preparation later for Tantra practice, where we're doing a lot of visualizations of Buddhas and deities. But many people, I think, particularly in the modern world, find this very challenging. It's a complex visualization, and often we're not very good at visualizing. So I think for many of us, that's going to be difficult to use initially. And so therefore we have a number of different options. So the recommendation is try a few different ones, experiment a little bit, see which one works best for you, and then stick with that. And again, following Tsongkhapa's advice, he says, if you keep moving from one object to another, you'll never achieve shamatha. It'll become a great obstacle to achieving shamatha. So stick with one object. And the object that we're using in this program is the breath. And here we saw this recommendation from the great Indian Buddhist master, Sangha from the 4th century, who says, if involuntary thoughts particularly dominate your behavior, then focus the mind in the mindfulness of exhalation and inhalation of the breath. I think this accounts for most of us in the modern world. We are often caught up in a lot of obsessive compulsive thinking. And so therefore, Sangha is recommending, I think, for most of us in the modern world, therefore focus on the breath. And there are great advantages for that. One, of course, is that by we can get out of our obsessive compulsive thinking mind and into the body. And unfortunately, many of us in the modern world have even lost touch with our body because we're so caught up in our head. So that's a good start. And a lot of our compulsive thinking is about the past and the future. And by focusing on the breath, that brings us into the present moment, because the sensations of breath only happen in the present moment. And also, as we saw, the breath is something readily available. It's always there. And for many of us, it's an easier object to focus on because it's a physical, tangible object. Whereas an object such as the mind is a more subtle object, a little bit more difficult to focus on. And so in this program, we're looking at 3 variations of this mindfulness of breathing program, mindfulness of breathing practice, sorry. We looked at last session, the full body breath practice, simply noticing any sensations in the body connected with the breathing. This was particularly good for relaxation, similar to the meditation we just did now, the focusing on the rhythm of the breath, also very diffuse focus, very good also for cultivating relaxation. And then later in this session, we'll be looking at the practice of focusing at the area of the abdomen. And this is particularly good for improving stability of attention. And we'll also look at some other things to add to the practice to help improve stability. And then in next week's session, we'll be focusing at the entrance of nostrils. This is particularly good for enhancing clarity of attention. So this is the object that we're using in this Shamatha program. And then we saw that in terms of tools in this Shamatha training, we have 2 main tools. And we saw here that the analogy, and we'll see this later when we look at the stages of progress in this color chart, Shamatha chart, that the elephant symbolizes the mind. And here we see the meditator and the elephant of the mind. And we see initially the elephant of mind is running wildly away from the meditator, which means that initially what we find is our mind is sort of completely out of control. And so we need to tame that mind. And so we have these 2 tools symbolized here with in the meditator's left hand is a rope and in the right hand a hook. So the rope is symbolizing mindfulness, that we're tying our mind with a rope of mindfulness to the object. Mindfulness here is simply our ability to attend continuously to a familiar object without forgetfulness or distraction. Literally, the original Sanskrit term smrti and Pali term sati literally means to remember. So mindfulness is simply our ability to remember the object, to hold the object without becoming distracted. Together with that, we need a second tool, quality control, to monitor that mindfulness. That's the job of introspection. Introspection is monitoring the mindfulness, noticing if our mind is becoming dull or distracted, and then fixing that accordingly. And we'll look at those two imbalances of laxity and excitation a little bit later in this session. So these are the two main tools we use in shamatha: the rope of mindfulness and the hook of introspection, to hook the mind back when we notice we've become dull or distracted. And so that brings us to the main topic today, which is faults. What sorts of faults can arise in this practice and how do we overcome them? And here we have a quote from great 16th century Tibetan master Panchen Losang Chegi Gyaltsen from the Geluk school of Tibetan Buddhism. And in his Mahamudra text, but in the Shamatha section, he says, shamatha is attained by progressing through the 9 stages. And the 9 stages are, we see very clearly drawn out here in this color diagram on this slide, this windy road all the way up to shamatha, which we'll start to look at later, that we can progress through these 9 stages by relying on the 8 antidotes to abandon the 5 faults. So let's have a look at these 5 faults and what are the 8 antidotes. Now, the first fault is laziness. And we see for laziness, there are 4 antidotes: faith, aspiration, enthusiasm, pliancy. Just like everything in our life, if we don't see any benefit in an activity, then of course we're going to be very lazy when it comes to doing that activity. Similarly, here in shamatha practice, if we don't really appreciate the benefits of shamatha practice, we're not going to put any effort into it. We're going to be very lazy when it comes to doing this practice. So therefore, the first antidote is faith. And faith is reflecting on the benefits of this practice and understanding how this practice is going to bring us enormous benefits. Then we'll develop faith that this practice is going to benefit us. Having developed faith in the practice that it will benefit us, that will lead us to want to do the practice more, which is aspiration. So that will lead to the second antidote. We'll aspire more to do the practice. And the more aspiration we have to do this practice, the more effort and enthusiasm we'll have in actually doing the practice. So that is the third antidote: enthusiasm, or putting actual effort into the practice. And then the more enthusiasm or effort we put into the practice, the more we'll have the fourth antidote, pliancy. And pliancy here is flexibility or serviceability of body and mind. Now our body and mind are not very flexible or serviceable. We often have a lot of aches and pains in the body, and we often have a lot of resistance in the mind to this practice. But the deeper we go into the practice, the more flexible and serviceable both our body and mind will become. And we'll look at this pliancy in a little bit more detail, I think, in session 5 in this program, when we look at the higher end of this 9 stages to shamatha, actual achieving of shamatha. So this is the first fault, the fault of laziness. And on that point, we see at the bottom here a quote from Tsongkhapa from his shamatha section of his Lam Rim text. He says, "If you cannot stop the laziness of being disinclined to cultivate concentration and of enjoying things that are not conducive to it, from the outset, you will not gain entry into concentration." So again, it's really understanding the benefits of this practice. But even at a sort of a little bit deeper level, what Tsongkhapa is really saying here is that if we still have this idea that the source of my happiness and suffering is coming from out there, then we're going to be chasing after all those sense pleasures. And we're going to be disinclined to doing the shamatha practice because we're going to be too busy trying to get all those pleasurable things out there that seem to be the source of our happiness. And so therefore, to really cultivate this view of genuine happiness, that the source of our happiness is not any of those sensory stimulus out there. The source of happiness lies within our own mind, this genuine happiness, inner well-being. And that shamatha is the doorway that opens the doorway to finding that genuine happiness. So if we want to really strive for genuine happiness, then shamatha practice is key in that pursuit. And then by knowing this, then we'll really be able to overcome that laziness. We'll have a lot of enthusiasm to do this practice, understanding that it is key in terms of achieving genuine happiness, inner well-being. If we then look at the second fault is forgetfulness. And forgetfulness here can mean either forgetting the instructions or forgetting the object. The antidote is mindfulness. Mindfulness being remember the instructions, remember the object, to hold the object. And then the third fault is this pair of laxity and excitation, in other words, dullness and distraction. And the antidote to this is introspection. So we saw earlier that the introspection is quality control. Introspection is monitoring mindfulness, noticing if we're becoming dull or distracted, if we're falling into laxity or excitation. So this is the antidote to these two, and I'll explain a little bit more about what these two imbalances are in the next couple of slides. But just to complete the list of 5 faults first, and 8 antidotes, the fourth fault here is non-application. Non-application means that we've noticed our mind has become dull or distracted and we don't do anything about it. That's a problem, that's a fault. So the antidote is application. So application here means simply remedy that. And very often the remedy is simply to reapply mindfulness if we've become dull or distracted. But there's still another fault called over-application, which for us as beginners is not really a big issue, but it can start to become a fault the higher we go into this practice. And over-application means that we are actually focusing on the object well, but we're unnecessarily applying effort to adjust our focus when we don't need to do that. That's a fault. And the antidote to that is equanimity. And here equanimity means balance. It means our mind is already balanced, so just leave it as it is. So the saying here is, if it's not broken, don't fix it. Don't tinker with the mind if it is focusing well. And that, again, can become a problem as we get higher into the practice. Initially, we need to keep adjusting our focus because as a beginner, we're very quickly and easily falling into laxity and excitation. So it's a fairly constant process of adjusting the focus, but higher in the practice, then we don't need to do that if we're focusing well. So these are the 5 faults and 8 antidotes. We apply those 8 antidotes to those 5 faults, we can slowly move along those 9 stages to shamatha. And after the next meditation, we'll look at the first 4 stages. But first, let's briefly look at laxity and excitation a little bit more. Laxity, and here we're quoting again from Tsongkhapa's Shamatha section of his Lam Rim text. And he says, laxity means that your mind's way of apprehending the object of meditation is slack, and it does not apprehend the object with much vividness or firmness, meaning our mind is sinking. And we can talk about 3 levels of laxity. The first here mentioned is coarse laxity. That's when our mind is sinking a lot, where it's sinking so much that we're actually disengaging from the object because it's sinking so much. Extremely coarse laxity would be we actually fall asleep in meditation. But the stage before that is we're sinking so much that our mind has become so dull, nothing's really registering anymore. A medium level of laxity is where actually the object is still appearing, but there's not much vividness or clarity there. There's sort of, we notice something, but it's not very clear. A subtle level of laxity is where the actual object actually appears vividly or clearly, but our attention is slightly slack. It needs to be a little bit more sharp, our attention. So we can see there are a gradient of levels of laxity to overcome. And often in the beginning stage where we're dealing with more coarse levels of laxity. But as we're going to see, particularly in tomorrow's session, when we look at the higher levels, the higher stages of progress, we start to then move through more and more subtle levels of laxity, overcoming more and more subtle levels of laxity, the higher we go in these 9 stages. Now, here as a beginner, we can use these 3 key words to remind us what to do in the event of laxity. One of the most common reasons we fall into laxity or dullness is we've simply lost interest in the practice. And so if we find our mind sinking in the practice because we've lost interest, the very first thing to do is refresh, meaning refresh our interest in the practice by briefly remembering the benefits of this practice to become enthusiastic about the practice again. And then restore our attention on the object means reapply mindfulness to the object, holding that object clearly again, and then to retain that ongoing flow of mindfulness of the object. So again, if we find ourselves sinking into dullness, laxity, refresh, restore, retain. That's laxity. What about excitation? Again, quoting Tsongkhapa. And Tsongkhapa says, what is excitation? It is an unquiet state of mind, considered a derivative of attachment, which pursues pleasant objects and acts as an impediment to shamatha. And so excitation here is the most common form of distraction, that we are pulled away by so-called pleasurable things, pleasurable objects. And we can see this here in this color diagram in the bottom right-hand corner. This is part of this 9-stage model that we see down the bottom of the color diagram here. We have a silk cloth. So that is tactile. And then to the left of that, we have some fruit. So that is taste. And then diagonally above that, we have 2 round objects, which are symbols. So that is sound. To the left of that, we have a conch shell, which is full of perfume. So that is smell. And then diagonally above that, we have a round object, which is a mirror. So that's visual objects. So these are the 5 sense objects, which are the most common form of distraction, where that we're pulled away by pleasurable things. And so that's why instead of distraction here, we see the word excitation. Like laxity, excitation has 3, we can talk about 3 levels of excitation. Coarse excitation is where we get completely distracted from the object. So that's easy to understand, just completely distracted. A medium level of excitation is where we're starting to get pulled away by the distraction, but we're still managing to hold on to the object a little bit. So you may have noticed that already, that you're focusing, say, on the breath, and then you start thinking about something, but somehow you're not completely caught up in your thoughts. Rather, you're mainly thinking about something, but a little bit in the corner of the mind, you're still managing to hold on to the breath a little bit. That's medium excitation. Subtle excitation is a little bit the other way, is that you're focusing well on the object. So let's say, again, we're focusing on the breath. So we're focusing well on the breath, but a little bit in the background of the mind, there's some thoughts going on and you're paying a little bit of attention to those, but mainly you're focused on the object. That's subtle excitation. So like laxity, as we move through these 9 stages, we are overcoming more and more subtle levels of excitation. Again, initially at the beginning stage, tends to be we're dealing with coarse excitation, where we're completely distracted all the time. But then as we're going to see in these first 4 stages, that we'll start to get to the point where we don't really lose the object. even though the mind is starting to get pulled away. So that's a more medium level. And eventually at the higher levels of this path, we'll get rid of even this background noise that's often there. Again, as a beginner, to remind us what to do in the event of excitation or distraction, we have these three key terms. Now, as a beginner, again, coarse excitation is dominant. So we get distracted. And then often we feel like the reason I got distracted is I didn't clamp down hard enough on the object. So the tendency can be to get frustrated first that we get distracted and then clamp down more forcefully. So to avoid that, the very first thing to do if we notice we've become distracted is relax. Relax the body and the mind. And then just very gently release the distraction and then return to the object without clamping down harder. So relax, release, return. Each time you notice you get distracted. So this is laxity and excitation. There's a little bit more to talk about those two, but we'll leave that to the next session. So I want to talk a little bit more about those because they are the two main imbalances that we're overcoming as we move through these 9 stages. But that's enough for this session. So that brings us to the actual meditation now. And we'll now move to do the mindfulness of breathing, focusing on the area of the abdomen. So the object in this practice is the actual sensations of the rising and lowering of the abdomen as you breathe. We're observing those tactile sensations. So we're using what's called bare attention, meaning we're not somehow imagining or visualizing the abdomen. We're actually observing the tactile sensations of the rising and lowering of the abdomen as we breathe. And we're going to emphasize stability of attention here, but not at the cost of losing relaxation, not in the cost of tightening our focus to gain stability. So maintaining the basis of relaxation while we are stabilizing the attention on the object. Now, we're going to introduce partway through this meditation a short-term strategy that you may find helpful initially to help stabilize the attention more. And that is counting the breath. Because if we are occupying the mind by counting the breath, there's less space in the mind to get caught up in distractions. And there are many ways to count the breath. What we're going to do in this session is we're going to count at the end of the in-breath. So focusing on the sensations of the abdomen as we're breathing in. At the end of the in-breath, mentally note 1, and then focus on the sensations of the abdomen on the out-breath, on the following in-breath. At the end of the next in-breath, mentally note 2. And we'll count from 1 up to 10, and then we'll go back to 1. If you lose count at any time, go back to 1 again. Now, this is not mindfulness of counting. We're not swapping focusing on the abdomen with just counting. The main object is still focusing on the sensations of the breath in the area of the abdomen. It's only very briefly at the end of every in-breath to do the count. And so we'll bring that in partway through the meditation to see if it helps to stabilize your attention. Now, counting the breath is not part of the standard practice because we're adding some conceptual activity. But in the initial stages, you may find it helpful if you are getting distracted a lot to help stabilize the attention. As we go deeper into this practice and our stability of attention improves, then we'll need to let go of counting the breath because it will start to become simply another distraction. But initially, it could be helpful in stabilizing attention. So let's try that out partway through the meditation. That's the meditation we're going to do now. Find a nice, comfortable posture. Let's begin. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. And with each out-breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen, happily releasing them. And simply allowing the mind to come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. And now, whilst maintaining that basis in relaxation, bring your attention to the sensations of the breath in the area of the abdomen, focusing on the sensations of the rising and lowering of the abdomen as you breathe. And maintaining an ongoing flow of mindfulness of the sensations of the breath throughout the entire cycle of each in and out breath. If you find that you get distracted from the breath, no need to get frustrated or upset. In fact, be happy you've noticed you've become distracted. And the very first thing to do is relax. Then release the distraction and very gently return to focusing on the breath. So relax, release, and return each time you become distracted. Simply keep coming back to the breath again and again, patiently and happily. And if you find yourself simply falling into dullness or laxity, then refresh your interest in the practice. Restore your attention on the breath, that is, sharpen your focus, and then retain an ongoing flow of mindfulness of the breath. Refresh, restore, retain. We'll now introduce counting the breath to see if it helps to stabilize the attention. Again, at the end of the in-breath, mentally note 1, and then focus on the sensations of the breath on the following out-breath, the following in-breath. At the end of the next in-breath, mentally note 2. In this way, counting from 1 up to 10, and then go back to 1. If at any time you lose the count, simply go back to 1. And we can bring the meditation to a close. Let's now begin to briefly look at this classic 9-stage model to shamatha that was mentioned in an earlier quote, that shamatha is attained by progressing through the 9 stages, relying on the 8 antidotes to abandon the 5 faults. So we have this color diagram here that you, I think, all have access to. And it says this is accomplished through the 6 powers and 4 mental engagements. And here we have these 9 stages listed, from directed attention up to attentional balance. We'll look at the first 4 of those stages today, and then the remaining 5 stages we'll look at next week. The 6 powers are what enables us to go to the next stage of those 9 stages. So we'll see how that works as we go through this description of the 9 stages. And 4 mental engagements is how the type of mental engagement involved at the various stages. And we'll explain more about that shortly as we go through the stages. So let's look at the first stage here. Stage 1 at the bottom of that color diagram is called directed attention. And also with that color diagram, there was another diagram that was part of the handouts, this black and white diagram, which has also numbers on it, and then a description on the back with all the descriptions for the various points here. And so here we see, again, the meditator at the beginning there with rope in the left hand, as rope is symbolizing mindfulness. Right hand is the hook of introspection. The elephant is symbolizing the mind, and the black color is symbolizing laxity or dullness. The monkey is symbolizing discursive thought in general. The black color is symbolizing this excitation. And also here we see the flame on the side of the path. Now the flame here on this black and white diagram is number 5. And if we go on the back there, number 5 says, from here until the 7th stage, the flame progressively decreases in size until it becomes absent. This difference denotes the measure of the strength of effort required regarding mindfulness and introspection. And what we'll see is initially here, the flame is very big at the beginning, which means we need to put a lot of effort into mindfulness and introspection because they're not very well developed initially. And so there needs to be a lot of effort in the practice for using mindfulness and introspection. But as we move through these 9 stages and our mindfulness and introspection get better, then we'll need less effort. And eventually we'll see at the higher stages of progress, it becomes actually effortless because our mindfulness and introspection is so well developed, they're just naturally there. We don't need to apply effort in terms of mindfulness and introspection. Let's have a look at this first stage. It's called directed attention. What we notice here is that the elephant and the monkey are running wildly ahead of the meditator, meaning that actually at the first stage of shamatha practice, what we notice is that our mind is completely out of control, that we try to focus on the object, and here we're using the breath. And then usually after a couple of seconds, we become distracted from the object. And then often it's many minutes later that we go, oh, hang on, I'm supposed to be focusing on the breath here. We go back to the breath again for another 2 or 3 seconds, and then off we go again on one of our stories. And so when we have this experience initially, then often we go, I can't meditate. I just can't meditate. In fact, I must be doing something wrong because my mind seems to be more out of control and chaotic now than it used to be before I started meditating. So I'm definitely doing something wrong and I can't meditate. If this is your experience, good news. You can meditate. You're making progress. The very first sign of progress in this shamatha practice is simply noticing how chaotic and out of control our mind really is. If we've never sat down and focused on an object such as the breath before, we may have this illusion that, my mind is sort of okay. I should be able to focus on the breath okay. I might get a little bit distracted, but that can't be too difficult, can it? And so when we sit down and we find that we can hardly focus on the breath at all, and we're distracted for long periods of time, well, that's our experience. But actually, that's good news. That's first stage of progress. So directed attention is simply what we achieve is simply being able to direct the attention to the chosen object for a second or two. And so for focusing on the breath, many of us can achieve this first stage at the first attempt. And we do that through the power of learning or the power of hearing. That first we need to hear some instructions about this practice. What is this practice? How to do the practice? And then we put those instructions into practice, we can achieve the first stage. What problems persist at this first stage, though, is there's no attentional continuity of the object. We only can hold it for a couple of seconds and we're distracted for long periods of time. So the main imbalance here is this coarse excitation, where we are completely distracted from the meditative object. And so therefore, the type of mental engagement here that we use is what's called focused, meaning because we're mostly distracted, we have to put a lot of effort to simply focus on the object. That's what focus means. We have to keep focusing again and again on the object. This is the first stage of practice. If we keep practicing, then we'll go around the bend, and the bend symbolizes the power needed to go to the next stage. And so to get to stage 2, the next power is thinking about the practice. By thinking about the practice, then we can get to the second stage. Because if we think about the practice, understand the practice better, get more enthusiastic about the practice, we can go a little bit further in the practice. And so the second stage is called continuous attention. That doesn't mean we can continually attend to the object all the time. It means that now at stage 2, we see the elephant and monkey are not running so fast anymore. And there's a little bit of white on top of the head. This is a symbol symbolizing stability and clarity. So now our mind is becoming a little bit more stable, a little bit more clear. Meaning now at stage 2 of progress, we can focus on the object maybe up to a minute or two before we become distracted. And still though at stage 2, we tend to be distracted for long periods of time. So even at stage 2, we tend to be more off the object than we are on the object. And so that is the problem that still persists, is that most of the time we're still distracted from the object. So again, the main imbalance here is still coarse excitation, where we completely get distracted from the object. And so therefore, the type of mental engagement is still focused. We need to put a lot of effort to keep coming back and focusing on the object again and again and again. That's stage 2. Then we see another bend in the road to go to stage 3 and 4, and that bend is the power of mindfulness. It's through the power of mindfulness getting better and better that enables us to go deeper into the practice to stage 3 and 4. So let's have a look at stage 3 and 4. Stage 3 here is called resurgent attention. What we see here now is that the rope of mindfulness is tied to the elephant of the mind, meaning now our mindfulness is getting a lot better. And so by stage 3, we can focus on the object for up to 5 or 10 minutes at a time. And now if we get distracted, we quickly recognize that and quickly come back to the object. And that's symbolized by the elephant turning the head backwards, meaning we return to the object very quickly. Now we see that the rabbit has come into the picture on the back of the elephant. The rabbit is symbolizing subtle laxity, subtle dullness. And so from here on, for the next few stages, we need to start to pick up this subtle laxity, this subtle sinking, because if we don't, we'll get stuck here. Because at stage 3, we can focus on the object quite well, 5 or 10 minutes at a time. If we get distracted, we quickly recognize that and quickly come back. So we may have this illusion that actually I think I'm getting close to shamatha because I hardly get distracted, and if I do, I quickly come back. Still a lot of still a lot of work to do in terms of quality of attention. Our mind is not sharp or clear yet. And so we have to pick up the fact that our mind is sinking a little bit. If we don't, we won't be able to progress. So here, what we achieve at the third stage is swift recovery of distracted attention. So we are mostly on the object. If we get distracted, we quickly come back. And we can get there through the power of mindfulness. Mindfulness is getting a lot better now. We can hold the object longer. And then if we get distracted, we quickly come back. What problems persist is that still we do forget the object entirely for brief periods of time. So we still have a little bit of coarse excitation here at stage 3. But now, because we're mostly on the object, instead of focused engagement where we had to keep refocusing again and again on the object, now it's what's called interrupted mental engagement. That is, we're mainly focusing on the object, but every now and again we're interrupted by laxity and excitation. Now, what does it mean to be at stage 3? For example, here, stage 3, at stage 3, we can hold the object maybe 5 or 10 minutes at a time. And if we get distracted, we quickly recognize that. If that is our normal experience in meditation, that's what it means to be at stage 3. It's not like the first time we have a meditation where that happens, we're suddenly at stage 3. Because sometimes we'll have a more peak experience where we'll be a little bit better, sometimes a little bit worse. But if our average meditation experience is that we can hold the object 5 or 10 minutes at a time, and if we get distracted, we quickly recognize that. If that's our normal average experience in shamatha, we're at stage 3. Stage 4, now mindfulness is getting very good. So let's have a look at stage 4 called close attention. And in close attention, now we can hold the object the entire session without ever completely losing it. So that's what we achieve now. And we achieve that through, again, the power of mindfulness getting better and better. But what problems persist here at stage 4 is there can be some complacency regarding samadhi, regarding this practice, because now we can hold the object the entire session. And so we think, well, I think I'm nearly at shamatha, and we get a bit complacent in our practice because there's still a lot of work to do on the quality of our attention. So that complacency can cause us to get stuck here. So the imbalances now is we still have coarse laxity. We still have quite a lot of sinking, but now we never get distracted. So we don't have coarse excitation. We just have medium excitation. Medium excitation is where we start to get pulled away, but we're still holding on a little bit to the object. And so again, the mental engagement at this stage is interrupted, that we're holding the object, but every now and again we're interrupted by laxity and excitation, particularly here, coarse laxity and medium excitation. But stage 4 now, we're not really no longer a beginner in the shamatha practice. We really have a sense that we are getting somewhere significant in this practice. We're more a seasoned meditator now. We can really hold the object longer. We can hold the object the entire session. And by stage 4, we're probably being able to meditate up to an hour at a time on the object. Whereas at the beginning, we don't want to try that. That'll be too long. So in the beginning stage is probably 15, 20 minutes or so. But by the time we get to stage 4, we can probably meditate up to an hour, holding the object the entire session without ever completely losing it. Still, though, we need a lot of work on quality of our attention. And that's what we're going to look at in these middling stages in next week, stages 5 up through to 9, how we can improve that quality of attention, more and more subtle degree, overcoming more and more subtle degrees of laxity and excitation. That's all I wanted to cover in these 9 stages this week, which means now we have some time for question answer. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, or if you prefer, you can raise your hand as an option and ask the question directly. So do we have any chat questions yet, Sunny?
At this point, we don't have any chat questions, and I don't see any raised hands, but I do have some questions from previous sessions, from the first 2.
Sure.
One question was, when you have like a 20-minute meditation session, does that include preliminaries also? Remember, we were talking about preliminaries in the first.
Sure. Yeah. So this is something in terms of, and we'll look at this more later in a later session, particularly the last session, is that with this shamatha practice, we're always emphasizing quality over quantity. Because if we try and meditate too long in a given session, we won't be able to sustain that. And what will happen is in the latter part of the meditation, we'll sort of give up and we'll just get caught up in complete daydreaming and complete dullness. And so actually then we're actually increasing the very faults we're trying to decrease. So it's counterproductive to try to meditate too long. So how long to meditate? It will depend on us, our capacity. But as a beginner, often anywhere between 15 to 20 to 25 minutes is a good amount of time. You find those of you who have read Alan Wallace's book, Attention Evolution, he talks about doing 24-minute sessions. Now, the reason he says 24 is that he's taking that from the early meditation texts from ancient India. And in ancient India, they didn't break up the day into hours, minutes, and seconds. They broke up the day into 60 units. And 1/60th of a day is 24 minutes. And that unit was called Gatika. And so often in texts, initially it would say as a beginner, 1 Gatika is a good amount of time to meditate. So hence 24 minutes. But I think us as beginners, we can adjust that if we find that 24 minutes is just, we can't sustain that, maybe 15 minutes, or some of us maybe 30 minutes, but always emphasizing quality over quantity. And in terms of how much of that time in terms of preparation and actual meditation, that would depend on how quickly we can prepare body, speech, and mind. What we don't want to do is leave it out or cut it short, thinking, well, I want to just do more actual meditation and not really do the preparation. So that's not going to set us well. And so you may find on some meditation sessions, your mind and body is naturally more relaxed and quiet. So you may be able to go through that preparation very quickly in a minute or two and be very well prepared to start the actual meditation. On other days, you may have a lot of agitation and tension, a lot of things going on in the mind. You may find you need 5 or 10 minutes to prepare, or you may find that you need the whole meditation session to prepare. That's time well spent. So don't cut it short. Use as much time as you need to prepare. Once you feel you're really prepared well in terms of body, speech, mind, then move into the actual meditation session. If you want to meditate longer, but you can't sustain it, then let's say you want to meditate 45 minutes every morning, you can't sustain that. Break that into 2 20-minute sessions with a little 2-minute break in the middle. But we're always emphasizing quality over quantity. And as we start to go a little bit more into the practice, if we only ever say meditate 15 minutes or 20 minutes in the morning, then there's only so much progress we can make. So therefore, once we start to get into the practice, we'll need to extend the amount of time we meditate from 15 to 20 to 25 to 30, increasing in 3 to 5 minute increments. How to know when to increase the time you meditate? One measure is if our normal experience is that at the end of the meditation, our normal experience is, oh, I would have liked to do a little bit more. That's a sign to start to increase, but always emphasizing quality over quantity.
Thank you. Pat Kelly asks, can you speak more about laxity and how it affects meditation? What is laxity? When the rabbit goes from all black to half black, what does that signify?
Yeah. So in this session, I mentioned that laxity is this sinking of the mind. And we saw that we can sort of divide that sinking into 3 levels. Of course, when we go, the heaviest level of sinking in meditation is we actually fall asleep in meditation. That's extreme coarse laxity. The coarse laxity is where our mind is sinking to the point where it really starts to not be aware of the object anymore. It's hardly noticing the object because our mind is sinking so much. And then that medium level of laxity is where the object is appearing. We're holding the object, but it's not very clear. A subtle level of laxity is where the object is quite clear, but our attention is a little bit slack. We need to sharpen the attention a little bit. And we'll talk more about both laxity and excitation in detail in the next session next week, particularly in terms of also three remedies or 3 levels of remedy of how to overcome that laxity and excitation. So that's going to come next week. But one point that I did briefly mention in this session was one of the most common reasons for falling into laxity or dullness is we've simply lost interest in the practice. And so therefore, if we are simply doing this practice because someone told us it's a good thing to do and we're not really interested in doing it, then of course we're just going to fall into dullness and laxity. It's the same as if at home we're watching a program on TV in the evening and we're not interested in it. We're going to get dull and drowsy and maybe even fall asleep in front of the TV. However, if we're watching a program on TV in the evening and we're completely interested in what the program is, we'll be very much glued to the TV. We'll be sharp focus on the program. Similarly here, if you find yourself falling into laxity and dullness because you've really lost interest in the practice, then we need to gain that enthusiasm by reflecting on the benefits and how this practice is integral to our pursuit of genuine happiness, and really to become enthusiastic about the practice. But more on laxity will come next week.
Stephanie asks, I can't focus on my breath. I know it seems weird, but I can't feel it. And when I try to focus on it, then it seems unnatural and I am making it slower or faster, and counting doesn't work either.
Yeah, a couple of points here. One is that we're not, we're just watching the breath. We're not manipulating the breath. And maybe I mentioned in an earlier session is particularly for us in the modern world, we like to control things. We're a little bit control freaks, to be honest. And the breath is something we certainly have some control over. And so we like to control it. And often people have this idea that in meditation, I need to make my breath rhythmic, or I need to make it subtle or something. And so we try to force the breath in some way. So we don't want to do that. If you notice that you're controlling the breath, just let that go, let it go, let it go, let it go. And in terms of the breath, there are these 3 variations: the full body, the rhythm, the abdomen, nostrils. And so initially what can be helpful is simply just notice any sensations in the body connected with the breath. And that is relatively easy to focus on. Start there. And then as you get more stability, clarity, then you'll be able to pick up more and more subtle sensations. And probably if many of you who've not really done the nostrils practice, or you started it some years ago, you probably noticed initially you didn't notice pretty well anything here. That's not because there's no sensations here. It's because our clarity of attention is not very well developed. So we focus here, we don't notice anything. So therefore, I would recommend maybe going and either staying there and just being patient and looking closely without tensing, start to pick up some sensations here. Or if not, you can go back just noticing the rising and lowering of the abdomen. If you don't really notice much there, then just go back to noticing any sensations in the body connected with the breathing, and really just start there and keep going there for some time. Then later you can move to looking at the abdomen and see how that works. And then hopefully later you can move to nostrils and start to really pick up some sensations there. I think we've got time for maybe one more question.
Okay. Michael Komorowski, besides breath, what else can be the object?
We mentioned that, I think, a little bit in the last session. Alan Wallace particularly recommends using the mind, or in other words, observing thoughts, or the resting in awareness practice. I particularly like those 2 practices. The observing thoughts, many people find extremely challenging because we don't have a habit of observing thoughts. But what I do find is that the resting in awareness practice, once people appreciate what the practice is, I find many people gravitate to that practice. And so I would recommend getting some instructions on the resting in awareness, trying it out, and see whether that's a suitable object. Well, actually it's no object, but that's a suitable approach to shamatha practice. It's one that I really put a lot of emphasis on myself personally and find very helpful for us in the modern world. So certainly I would recommend to get some instructions there, try that out. And then other objects, as we saw in this and earlier sessions, you can use a mental image of a Buddha, but many people find that extremely challenging because we're not very good at visualizing, and it's a complex visualization. Some people who are naturally gifted at visualizing find that extremely helpful, so they can use that. And so these are probably the 4 objects that are most widely emphasized in many of the Buddhist traditions, particularly in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition. So I would sort of stick with one of those 4 objects, and you'll probably find one of those will be the optimum object for you. Right, we've run out of time now, unless there's a very quick question. Do we have a quick question?
Somebody had a question. I had a teacher who suggested that you think clear mind on the in-breath and don't know on the out-breath. Is that the same as counting the breath?
Sounds like I'd have to see more about the context for those instructions, but yes, I mean, we can use initially some commentary to help us to stay focused, to remind us of what to do. So yes, in terms of observing the breath, we can count the breath, or we can note the breath, like breathing in, breathing out, or clear mind, or release the mind in the out breath. So these are all short-term strategies to help us to get into the practice, adding a little commentary, but they wouldn't be part of the standard practice because we're adding something to the practice. So you would find that even though maybe initially they could be helpful, as you get into the shamatha practice, go a bit further, you'll need to let go of that commentary because it's adding stuff, because eventually it'll just become another distraction. So use it sparingly if you find it helpful, and eventually you'll need to let go of any of that sort of commentary. Right, we'll run out of time there. So let's leave it there. And before we finish, let's again dedicate all of our efforts today in this session, again using the Shantideva dedication prayer. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. Next session will be, again, as per normal, next Tuesday. And session 4, we'll be looking at the mindfulness of breathing practice, focusing at the entrance of the nostrils. And also we'll be looking at these faults of laxity and excitation, a little bit more detail, how to overcome them effectively. And we'll look at stages 5 to 9 in that shamatha shamatha chart, the stages of progress in shamatha. That's what we'll be covering next week. Until then, stay safe, stay well. We'll see you back here same time next week. Bye now.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn.